Okay, so we are starting our first lecture within a series called affectalks. So I'm very, very glad that we host here our first speaker. Before that, I would like to welcome you all on behalf of the Institute of Cultural and Memory Studies of Research Center of Slovenian Academy of Sciences and Arts. So affectalks is actually a lecture series which is organized within a project Music and Politics in the Post-Yugoslav Space toward the new paradigm of politics of music in the 21st century. The project is financed by the Slovenian Research Agency. So follow us also on Facebook, Music Affect Politics, so you will hear also about the next speakers in our lecture series, but we are very, very great and who is Ian MacMillen. He's a lecturer in music at Yale University, and here is actually from fall this year also a Fulbright scholar in Bulgaria, so with a lectureship at New Bulgarian University. However, he has also a very, let's say, rich career in the study of East European music and in general East European, Central and East European studies. So he was also director of the Center of Russian, East European and Central Asian Studies at Oberlin College and Conservatory, where he taught courses in ethnomusicology and East European studies. So what he will present also today is a part of his research focus on popular and traditional music in Southeastern Europe, mainly concentrated in the fieldwork in Eastern Croatia, then Vojvodina, Serbia, and his current research in Sofia, Bulgaria. So in addition to the monograph on tambura music in Croatia, so this is the book basically he will talk about today to us, which was published in 2019. His research also appears in many other important publications in the field of ethnomusicology, such as Ethnomusicology Forum, Ethnomusicology, Hrvatski tamburaški breviar, and the Oxford Handbook of Slavic Folklore. His current book project is on music, memory, and forgetting, which is actually, as far as I understood, already solicited by the University of Chicago Press. So welcome, Ian, and the floor is yours. Another, I think, important technical thing before that is that this talk is recorded, just for you to know. And for anyone interested in posting question after the lecture, you can post your question in chat. So please feel free to do that after the talk. So Ian, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you to Anna Hoffman for inviting me. I'd like to thank particularly the Institute of Cultural and Memory Studies and the broader Slovenian Academy of Sciences and Arts for having me today. And thank you all for joining. I look forward to an interesting discussion following my presentation. Let me just share my presentation and we'll begin. And please, if there are any issues with hearing things on Zoom, perhaps you could post in the chat, and Anna, if anything appears, can you let me know? Would that be all right? I don't think I'll be able to see the chat very readily from how I'm presenting here. All right, so I'm here to present my book, Playing It Dangerously. This is a book that takes historical, but largely also anthropological and ethnomusicological approaches to relations between people in Croatia in particular, relations that are often gendered, ethnicized, and sometimes racialized, and on how affect, but also the denial of affect, the blocking off of certain feelings, regulates those relations, and those relations, how they're regulated in their sociocultural forms, but also in their physical forms, interactions between people. The talk focuses on tambura music. This is a tradition of music that is played in orchestras and bands. There were several systems of tambura instruments developed over the 19th and early 20th century. I work mostly with bands in Eastern Croatia and parts of Serbia and Bosnia that play on the Srem system, pictured here at the top, but there were other systems developed that have fallen out of favor, no longer played much in Croatia, but that continue in places like the Czech Republic and Bulgaria today. So it's started as a solo tambura tradition. The original instruments are thought to have come likely with Ottoman forces into places where they were developed into an orchestra tradition. So Austria often sees itself in Eastern Croatia as the hub or the heart of the orchestral tradition from about the 1840s. And from there, things moved out in the Pan-Slavic movement. So you can find orchestras, again, quite broadly in the region, but I work mostly in Eastern Croatia, the region known as Slavonia. And my main field sites for this study were Osijek, or our Osijek, which is on the Drava River, not far from where the Drava meets the Danube, not far from the Serbian border. And then in Slavonski Brod, which is on the Sava River, across the border from Bosnia and Herzegovina. Let's listen to a little bit of this music. This is one of the most popular bands since the 1990s. Here playing actually a more traditional Slavonsko kolo, a circle dance piece. I'm getting a message in the chat that the presentation quality on Zoom is very low. Is this both the sound or is it primarily the visuals that's low? The visuals only. Let me zoom in a little bit. Perhaps this will recentering it. Yes, thank you. Hopefully this will fix some of the issue. I'll try to explain what we're seeing in case the visual quality is too low. So it's can be a very fast, sometimes virtuosic music tradition. And in part, the title "Playing It Dangerously" refers to this. So perhaps the largest compliment that a tambura player can receive is that he plays dangerously. And I say he because it's often implicitly gendered. This is a description that is lauded on mostly male musicians. But also this idea of playing dangerously on opasnu sfera connotes or is associated with certain aspects of lifestyle as well, not just musical technique. So the lifestyles of young bachelors, the so-called bečarska duša, the bachelor soul. So this shows a bit of the popular music scene. This is a recording I made about 11 years ago in Đakovo, not far from Osijek. A couple of songs about lamenting what it means to get married and what you lose when you get married, but also the women who don't want to have you if you're a tambura player who doesn't really want to get married. So you can see that people are dancing along with it, singing along with it. People know these songs. This is a tambura disco where they go here. It's really out of the folk music tradition and orchestral tradition developed into a contemporary band scene where people play this music and write their own popular songs, have hits with them, national radio, etc. But the description of someone playing it dangerously is also often associated in particular with Romani musicians, and people describe them as playing the most dangerously. This is a band I worked with from the region that plays in Osijek. This is actually recording is from an advertisement that the owners of the Krishna called Ruže, one of the popular taverns there, made to promote them online. So you can hear them on Thursdays through Saturday evenings at this restaurant. Clarify that 3 of the 5 instruments here are tambura. So it's tambura bass, contratambura, which plays the chords or accords, and brach tambura. And many of the Romani groups, like this one here pictured at the top, actually have far more. So often have 5 tamburas combined with accordion and violins, typical for some of the Romani ensembles in the area. This is a diverse scene around Osijek, particularly in this area. I worked with musicians of Romani background, Croat background, Serb background. Just to hear a little bit of the latter. This is a recording actually made across the border in Serbia. It's a little bit on the quiet side because I was at a festival and couldn't get very close to them for the performance. But bands from Vukovar, this is a group based in Vukovar, but many musicians actually come from Osijek, which is not so far away. But they play in Croatia, they play in Serbia as well. I know it's very quiet. It's the song Rastao sam pored Dunava. I grew up along the Danube River. This is, again, a very active ensemble, though one of very few Serb bands active in Vukovar with this type of music. And in fact, in the discourses about tambura music, in the audiences and patrons of restaurants and venues where I hear this music, the dominant idea of a tamburash, a tambura player, is of a male Croat musician. And I'm going to read a little bit about this idea, because in fact, many of the ensembles are not Croat. Many of the ensembles are, in fact, there are more and more women ensembles playing this music as well. But in particular, with respect to Romani bands, groups such as these were ethnically and musically marked as foreign to the local tambura scene. When I called to ask in advance about a venue's live music lineup, restaurant staff repeatedly distinguished between their offerings of ciganska glazba, gypsy music, and tamburaška glazba, tambura music, despite the fact that Roman musicians predominantly played fretted tambura chordophones. Advertised to patrons simply as cigani, or more rarely as Roma, these bands were ethnically and at times racially marked. This is also despite the fact that many of the Croat bands I worked with also incorporated violin and accordion in their own songs. Comments such as these seemed at odds with certain venues and their clients' patronage of Romani bands, as well as my frequent exposure to Romani tambura performance directly through promoters of Slavonian tambura music, who take me to hear Roma play when we went to restaurants with them for our interviews. They constitute, however, part of a tautology that has proliferated publicly for decades and that concerns the relationship among the players, the instruments, and the territories of tambura music. One side of the tautology, essentially circular logic, saying the same thing twice in 2 different ways that makes the one way support the other. One side asserts that tambura instruments and music are the national legacy of Croats, not of other ethnic groups or races. This is predominant among the patrons of these restaurants and venues and bars where I went. The other side states that Croats who play the instruments are tamburashi playing tambura music, but Serbs and Roma are foreigners playing Serbian and gypsy music from Serbia. In promoting such circular logic about who constitutes tamburashi, clientele and staff at Slavonian establishments often ignore or dismiss the use of the same instruments, repertoire, and venues by Roma and Serbs who have been situated or at least professionally active in Croatia for generations. They also commonly overlook the fact that the Ottoman Empire likely introduced the tambura to the region, and that Croats seemingly only began to view it as their national instrument in the 19th century, by which point it was also popular among many other ethnicities. And in fact, there are many other instruments that are viable candidates for a Croatian national tradition. The scenes I work with also have quite a lot of diversity in terms of gender and class. The idea that a tamburash is predominantly a male Croat in the idea focuses, of course, more on the background and the gender, and actually class is somehow less salient as a dividing factor here. So for instance, the person credited with developing the orchestra tradition, Pao Kolaric, was director of a number of banks, someone from upper socioeconomic level, and people turn to him as the founder of this tradition in Osijek, but people also love to hire those who could never afford music educations and taught themselves autodidactic education. This music is played in a wide range of venues, from hotels like the Waldner Hotel in Osijek, which attracts people with greater financial means, to bars and musicians on the streets. So you can hear in all sorts of places visited by people with a wide array of socioeconomic statuses. I promised to Anna that I would actually share a little bit about, or the reference to, an article on tambura economics and class diversity. This was actually planned originally as a chapter for this book, but I was asked by the publisher to reduce the overall word count of the text. This comes from pressures in American academic publishing in the last few years. This was the earliest published part of this project, the earliest article that came out, and it's also an open access journal, so I decided to leave this out and reference it in the book. But I'll talk briefly about some of the economic aspects of it here. Economics often intersect in interesting ways. Class often intersects with race and with racial and ethnic discourses in, I think, very telling ways in tambura music, both in Croatia and other parts of the former Yugoslavia, and also in North America, where I also work with tamburashi. These places, perceived differences in heritage have historically motivated forms of exclusion. So for instance, in North America, the exclusion of South Slavic immigrants from certain industries, from certain economic parties. Roma, of course, have also similarly been marginalized from certain educational, cultural, and often industrial or governmental institutions in many parts of Europe. And these distinctions can have significant economic results for the marginalized. And in turn, in the tautological form these discussions often take, that economic disadvantagement often reinforces or is interpreted as evidence of certain forms of separation and even inferiority, so cultural or ethnic or racial inferiority. But that said, class distinctions in tambura music rarely register without being couched in these sorts of ethnic and racial terms. So for instance, the idea of the Tsigan as a nomad is a common trope I heard in tambura music, despite the fact that Roma really aren't nomadic. They might cross borders to play, but it's their entire lifestyle that's nomadic. But the idea that they have this internalized biological feeling for movement, for always wandering around, and they carry with them pain, and that these are things born into them. Something that sometimes Roma musicians themselves reinforce, because also caters to the economic demand, right, to have that certain niche. So this is a book that is about attempts by musicians actually to counter some of those discourses, some of those ideas. Many of the tamburashi I worked with of all backgrounds, say we're all just tambura players, and they speak about this inclusive discourse, this inclusive idea of tambura music that also welcomes even women into the milieu. But then I'm also interested in how the interplay of embodied feeling and these national discourses and ideologies sometimes hamper, sometimes impede or stop those attempts to be more inclusive. In literature on not just tambura music, but music in general, I think when we talk about affect, there's often a focus on scenes that are saturated with affect, where feeling flows and people really feel very deeply. This includes some of the work by people like Matthijs van der Poort, written previously about tambura music in Vojvodina, for instance. So I'm interested in how the opposite, how might a lack of feeling or the inability or unwillingness to feel play into the navigation of diversity within tambura music. So I'll be addressing affects and individuals that are somehow out of place, that are not included in the same ways that other feelings, other people are included, and the structures of feeling that regulates tambura scenes today. Many of the musicians, as I mentioned, share the same repertoire and performance spaces, but they have they're welcome with different expectations, and those expectations and those performances and some certain differences in performance style produce, I think, quite different experiences that among different people of different backgrounds. These stem from different conditions and approaches that mark musical education between performers of different backgrounds, for instance, of Croat performers who largely have gone through post-secondary or at least secondary schooling in instruments, versus Roma who are often taught within their family or teach one another or figure it out on their own. On an affective level, there's also something shared, but a different way in which it's processed. So I'm interested in the experience called horripilation in physiological terms. This in English is often called goosebumps, goose flesh. It's when the hairs or the hair follicles on your arms or on your neck. That's people of both Romani and non-Roma background described to me. So listening to, for instance, Croat musicians, Croat fans often talk about the experience of having their hair stand on end when they listen to a particularly large tambura orchestra. And when they hear them closely coordinating their rhythms together, and the perfect experience, for instance, of hearing the ensemble known as Sto Tamburaša, the 100 tambura players, that's at least this time in the early 2010s rather, were meeting annually to perform, and where they really focus on coordinating this large orchestra so that the rhythm is very precise. All musicians are hitting the notes at the same time, and our audience members react to this and describe it as giving them goosebumps because they can hear the entire country of tambura players coming together. So it's this very cognitively processed idea of the structural coordination, rhythmic coordination of the band that reproduces this particular experience. And small ensembles can often really see at a very close level how they coordinate this, for instance, between the contra tambura player here, that's actually the lead singer plays the contra, and the bass tambura, and they have this very strong rhythm section that coordinates the rest of the melody instruments to their beat.
Evo ga, slušamo vas, dečki. Ajde.
Kad se sjetim ja, moja Juliška, kako
of course, here the clapping along, which is coordinating also, reinforcing this strong and what people refer to as čist or clean rhythm that's dominant in or prioritized in Croatian tambura playing. Whereas the reception of Romani tambura playing is typically that it's dirty, that malo prljavo sviraju. But dirtily. But this is something that is praised, that is revered among many non-Roma musicians. Predominantly, I was interviewing Croats and Serb tambura musicians who love this style and love it and refer to it as giving them goosebumps. It's also producing this same feeling, but that feeling is here tied to a very different mental experience, you might say. So here the experience is tied to what they profess as wonderment or curiosity or an inability to conceive of how Roma musicians actually play rhythmically the way in which they do. In my analyses, one thing that I found strikingly different in, for example, this particular Roma band's performance and their approach is that the bass or perda tambura and the contra tambura do not provide that sort of rhythmic grounding, that sort of center beat or background meter to which the other instruments coordinate. They don't function as a rhythmic section per se. Each player in the ensemble, which might have 7 or 8 musicians, instead, each player, all melody instruments, all the singers, push forward and back against a collectively slurred pulse or taktus or beat. So where exactly one person might be feeling the beat might be a little bit different from where the other person is feeling or playing it. Here in the transcription, the vertical wedges, the width of the wedge shows approximately how far in front one instrument or one player is attacking the note in comparison to another player. And so we can see, at one moment, the brač player might be ahead, and then at the next moment, he's a little behind the others. Other things to note are that, in fact, the bottom two, so the contra and then the bass, these are not the first instruments to come in. They come in a bit after the first 2 instruments. In fact, the bass is the last one to come in, when the bass, in theory, would be giving the hard downbeat in many other Slavic ensembles, Croat and Serb ensembles. And the overall effect is what I'm showing here on the right. So if 5 instruments were to play simultaneously, you'd have this kind of bundle of notes happening all at once. Whereas the middle column here shows the way in which many of the Croat and Serb ensembles would try to approach rhythm, which is 5 notes being played at once, but the effect is that you just have the single strike altogether. Let's listen to this performance. Same piece. I knew some bands who are not of Romani background, for instance, Croat bands, who try at times to attempt something like this, and some who have really tried very hard for years can do something like it, but a lot of bands get carried away with being too fast, and actually there were some moments that they weren't very proud of in their musical performance. For instance, this one group, this is the same exact venue. The Romani band wasn't available, and so they got a local Croat band, Hrvatski Sokol, to play for them. And they were trying to veer into the style of playing this more dynamic, rhythmically more dynamic style, to the point of the performance almost falling apart. At a certain point, the bass and contra players then started playing louder, and they reestablished the firm beat, and the other instruments eventually got back on track. But as they walked back to their tables afterward to take a break, they, looking a little bit embarrassed, they were sending each other these sort of sheepish, embarrassed smiles and laughing, and commenting that they barely got away with that one. So there's both a strong curiosity then with regard to how Roma play the way they do, and also a strong conviction that Romani technique and ability stem from this biological disposition for sadness and wandering, to which people also refer. Even though, of course, as I mentioned, Roma are not nomads. There was movements after the Second World War. Lots of people had to move during some of the periods of violence in Europe in the 20th century. But they, no longer not living nomadic lives. They experience, of course, a wide range of feelings. They don't approach this always with sadness. I'll read a second short excerpt that addresses this. This experience, this attempt to understand, but ultimately not really to be able to internalize the way in which Roma play from outside of these communities. At the point at which it is more comfortable and feasible to know an ethnic group and aspects of musical practices associated with it, tambura players defer examination of the technique and experiences of this practice from the affective to the discursive realm. The two ways of knowing and forms of relation are deeply connected to one another. They nonetheless veer toward distinct planes of awareness, one plane given to qualities and to named emotions, the other more toward general intensities and effectiveness. This is evident in the dynamic of articulation by which understandings objectify into discourses, into pronouncements of difference, such as the construction of dirtiness versus cleanliness. internalization remains elusive and through its very unattainability assumes the role of an affective supplement to discourse. Bourdieu argued that social practices emerge not merely via discursive objectification, but in an oscillation between objectification and embodiment, in which people ultimately internalize objectified structures as habitus. This dialectic does not internalize conscious thought unilaterally, as it may be affectively blocked. To restate the tenet detailed in this book's introduction, the affective block, as supplement or remainder, connotes both processes referenced by the term. It blocks or aggregates as a block of intensity, and it blocks or keeps at a remove. It blocks off. The inability to define Romani playing or responses to it operates at the level of autonomic intensity, especially with horripilation or goosebumps, in which fear and excitement remain an unqualified block of affect. It is just this non-distinction between fear and excitement that the acclamation that a musician plays dangerously is meant to recognize. It involves a transgression of musical sensibility and bodily comportment that few non-Roma claim to comprehend or are willing fully to embody in their musical assemblages. Affective engagement via what Barney Cox terms mimetic participation, which may transpire even in listening to music, risks a participatory transgression that is thrilling in its fearsomeness. The participation for the two instances identified here is quite different. Sensational knowledge of clean, satisfying rhythmic coordination marks the one experience, while a lack of understanding of dirty and fearsome exciting discrepancies in playing guides the other. About half of my fieldwork, in particular within the ethnographic sections, which are the dominant sections of the book, about half of that fieldwork I've carried out in Croatian enclaves outside of Croatia, in places like Serbia and Hungary, where the separation is due to the drawing of borders much more recently than the settlement of those groups. And so people often don't see themselves as being in the diaspora. I've also worked in countries like Canada and the United States where people do see themselves as being in the Croatian diaspora, but where sometimes they're even more involved in Croatian music and politics back in the, since the independence of Croatia in the early 90s. And in the book, I introduce a concept of national intimates to account for the similarities between these various enclaves, but also some of the important differences in how they relate to and participate in tambura music back in Croatia. Being in an intimate of Croatia involves a certain resistance to assimilation in the dominant culture in one's country of residence, and that resistance can take various forms. I became interested in how musicians might deliberately stave off forms of feeling, sentiments that might otherwise be shared with the dominant culture. So in other words, how they deliberately resist and not just passively or unable to feel the same way as people who they recognize or perceive as being ethnically or culturally or racially different. I particularly concentrated my ethnographic research in Croatian intimates on Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, at least when it came to the North American study, where the Croatian American tambura virtuoso, Jerry Grčević, here on the right, was born and raised, and where he collaborated with Miroslav Škoro, one of the most popular musicians and media moguls, and now politicians in Croatia. He, at the time in 1989, had joined his recently wed Croatian American wife in Pittsburgh. He and Grčević there wrote Moja Jurška, this song we've been listening to together, and released it back in Croatia in 1992. I first met Škoro in Mississauga, which is near Toronto in Canada, a few hours drive from Pittsburgh, where he performed this and other songs with Grčević. This was back in 2011. At that time, for a couple of years, he had been developing a routine, sort of comedic routine for performing this song back in Croatia, in which he would joke about this being a song that needs translation if you're going to sing it in a language such as Hungarian. The joke being that much of the second part of the song is just singing the syllable lai lai lai, which of course when you sing in Hungarian is also just lai lai lai. In places where I worked in Slavonia, political, cultural, and religious ties between Hungarians and Croats have been quite strong, in particular since the wars in the 1990s, when many Croats resettled from war-torn parts of Slavonia into southern Hungary. In fact, Škoro was working there as a diplomat, helping to meet those refugees at the time. Also in North America, there's a lot of shared experiences through intermarriage. Catholic immigrants who would often intermarry, Hungarians and Croats, for instance, and also Slovenes and other people from Central and Southeastern Europe play in the same tambura or polka ensembles together. Often also were racialized or marginalized together. So the term hunky comes from the word Hungarian and is a racialized epithet directed at immigrants, but not just people of Hungarian, people broadly coming from Austria, Hungary at the time. So many Croats, sometimes jokingly refer to themselves using this term, but it's seen as something that white Anglo-Saxon Protestants use, not just as a cultural, but really as also kind of, historically, there was this understanding or this idea that many immigrants from Austria-Hungary were not white or not white in the same way as other Americans. Here, there's an attempt to engage with that similarity, and in fact, that kind of shared sentiment and experience. And we'll listen to this performance. I think the effect is a sense of affective inclusion here between Croat and potential Hungarian listeners. There's good-natured joking and mutual understanding, I guess, of their shared positionality in places not only in Europe, but also and so a broader Austro-Hungarian Empire, but also in the diaspora. Let's listen to this here. I have a translation up above.
Hoćemo na mađarskom probati isti ovaj tekst. La 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 la. Ajmo još jednom na hrvatskom. La 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 la.
In the performance in Mississauga in Canada, however, this earlier performance, the early rendition with Hungarian and Croatian texts or Hungarian and Croatian versions, so to be called, of the La 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 section, serves more as a foil to distinguish between what's coming next and what they've already sung. Juxtaposition of certain physical and affective types of comportment or self-control that are not to be included, that are deemed too distant to be assimilated. And there is a sort of a corresponding form of affective distancing that goes on in the second part of the performance. This, again, the recording we just heard is in Croatia. What I'm going to talk about now happened in Canada, where they extended this beyond. So if humor here is more good-natured, but ultimately I read as being inclusive, it was pushed to the point of parody. So pushed farther in the performance in Canada, where he added German and Chinese versions, and for which he not only sang again "la la la," but also added in stereotypical gestures. So for the Germans, it was shaking fists in a mockery of the stereotypical German severity. For a Chinese version, he clasped hands like this in a bow pose and bowed many times while he was singing in a stereotype of East Asian courtesy, let's say. And the reaction was very different. So people weren't singing along during this. They were instead, howling with laughter, laughing out very profusely as he did these. And the result was that there was a very different form of interaction with him. So people weren't, embodying the gestures that he was kind of broadening beyond the Croatian type to the Hungarian, but rather, so Germans had a greater degree of integration and assimilation, especially after Second World War in the United States, and didn't face the same types of racialized forms of othering. There were cultural forms of othering against Germans in the United States, but it's different from how particular Croats and Serbs were treated. And China here serves as a different type of racial juxtaposition. So I read this as distinctions, though, also sincerity and insincerity, and what one is willing. It's not a matter of authenticity, really a matter of being able to believe that one is really trying to feel, really trying to project a sincere desire or cut against a sincere desire to co-feel with other people. I'm going to read some of my interpretation of this, just a couple The sincerity and affective labor on which Skoro has long prided himself in his performances did register at the Mississauga concert as an embodied interlocution between him and his audience. In this context, we read one another's intensities as sincere as he taught and led us with humor and yet with restrained comportment in the Croatian and Hungarian refrains, strategically engendered affects that contrasted with the clearly pantomimed German and Chinese renditions. The crux of this distinction was not whether Skoro could authentically embody Croatian and Hungarian, but not German or Chinese forms, but whether we could believe that he, as a male Croatian pop icon, was stepping into their gestures with sincerity, and whether he, in turn, could read this credibility in us. Such capacity is essential to understanding the work of racial sincerity and humor in Skoro's performances. Sincerity requires the participation of multiple subjects, and audience members were instrumental in clapping and singing along with evident earnestness during the Hungarian and Croatian verses. Their participation recognized and responded to the call for musical involvement and intersubjective reading typical of affectively engaged tambura performer-audience relations. In the other so-called versions, the musicians, particularly Skoro, strategically undercut the autonomic register in order to evince the insincerity of their embodiments. They qualified these gestures as racial distancing while reducing the risk of crossing into the intense embodiment of becoming, even as stereotypical gestures were the primary modality of this qualification. The joke in these latter iterations lay in the imitation of stereotypical ethnic gestures as a form of paralinguistic translation, a meta-signification, rather than in the non-translation of a syllable lie, which had been the predominant joke before, where you don't really have to translate. So you have to translate it with gestures to do giant German or Chinese, but with Hungarian, the joke is like, you don't actually have to translate, right? You can do it in Hungarian. The joke cut the gestural embodiment from its potential affective remainder, blocking the affect of the other. I have one more section to go through, and then we'll be happy to take questions. The other case study in the book looks at gender relations between clients and fans, and predominantly then the all-male Croat bands, all-male bands in general, with whom they interact in performances, but in some instances also female bands who increasingly in the early 2010s were becoming establishing themselves on the Croatian scene. Their physical relations between these fans, audience members, and the bands, in particular at parties and other settings where they can be in close physical proximity. These are typically very intimate settings, very intimate forms of interaction with physical forms of touching and reality. And bands work hard to cultivate this intimacy. It's often also tied to tipping. So if you're on good terms with people and allow them to be close to you physically as well as socially, you can often get better tips. But they bring in forms or invite forms of physical closeness that can be taken too far. They become unwelcome sometimes. Bands, for instance, often stand in an arc, almost a semicircle, and sometimes the lead singer will step forward, as with this group, Momci, in the middle to sing and be closer to the audience. Men in the audience or in the parties at tables often get up and stand in their own arc or semicircle that mirrors and completes the circle with the band, excuse me. In this case, we see them starting to form here, and then often one of them in turn will step forward to interact with the lead singer. And this might be to request a song, sometimes to stay up there and sing that song along with the band, sometimes singing well, sometimes singing not so well. And often the band will try to say, let's move on after the song and try to get back to a higher musical quality. This might involve also tipping, giving money directly to the lead singer. And in that way, the person who's entered the circle can often also regulate not just the band, but also the rest of the fans, the rest of the partygoers who might interact. So it might take the form of recruiting other men to come up and join the semicircle of listeners. It could also take the form of interacting with women, which is usually done by dedicating a song, perhaps to a wife or a girlfriend, for instance. And in this way, requesting the song, paying a tip, gives a person in theory the right to stay up there, even past the point of being welcomed by the band. Sometimes they wear out their welcome. So these are spaces then of great affective expression and reaction, interrelation, where structures of feeling are physically emplaced and embodied, but those structures become structures of inclusion, but also sometimes of exclusion. For instance, men turning their backs to the women who stay seated. I became interested then in what happens when those who are often excluded are more forcibly involved in those spaces of interaction, and those structures of group camaraderie among the men, and their forms of feeling. So people who might be out of place, sometimes actually are brought into the middle unexpectedly. This happened to me, for instance, at a wedding. I was there with the band who were playing for one of the band members, actually two of the band members, their sister was getting married, and I was invited along with the band, but didn't know many of the guests. I had gotten to know the young man in the purple shirt here, and I was taking a picture, and shortly after he welcomed me up to come join the circle. And I stood in between him and the man in the gray suit. Another man not pictured here was the first then to go into the middle of the circle. And I expected he would probably be asking the band for a certain song, something like that, but instead he turned toward us and started unexpecting us, looking at us in turn, walking around with his hands raised high, which is typical, and came and stood. I was next to the man in the purple shirt. He came and stood next to me, between me and the man in the gray suit, and hugged us, and then turned his face and gave me a kiss on the cheekbone, but pressed to the point actually where I felt a bruised sensation in the bone afterwards. A very, very hard kiss. Kissing is not atypical to situations between people who know one another, but I had only ever been kissed by very close associates. So, for instance, my so-called host father, who had arranged for my place of stay and involved me in certain types of fieldwork in Austria. I didn't know the person who kissed me here, so it was a form of affection that was quite forceful. And that took a standard, symbol of affection and made it do something different. So it blocked off certain forms of typical signification with this sign. But what was most really impressive, at least on me, was not quandary about what it might mean in this instance, but just really the physical pain that I felt. Right? I was kind of pushing this beyond the ability to really pay attention to or concentrate strictly on symbolization. In working with female tambura bands, I found there were similar forms of forced inclusion that took typical patterns of interaction to an extreme. This is a band called Goravushe, here playing a song called Ja sam mala garava. I am a young, swarthy or dark complexioned or dark-haired woman in this case. Goravushe refers to their hair color. It's actually, though, a line, the first line of the song, and the title of the song is taken from the refrain of the popular Russian romance song Ja sam Tsiganka sam mala, which the refrain starts Ja sam mala garava crna tvoja tsiganka. I'm a young dark woman, black gypsy. So they sometimes actually embrace the fact that they're sometimes othered or marginalized, but also attractive or interesting for patrons in the same way that Roma musicians might be.
Ja sam mala garava, duša mi je večarska, u kraju me svako zna, nema lole da me ne gleda.
Line here, referring to Dusha mi je večarska, also refers to their positioning, their self-positioning within the dominantly male, bachelor soul, bachelor lifestyle, which they often find themselves playing, even though not everyone who actually comes to these concerts, lots of married men come and listen to them as well. For instance, this group performed a typical semi-arc, mirroring the arc of women on stage. In this case, a man again stepped forward, but he didn't go up just to request a tip. He brought a chair forward, placed it in the middle of the circle, and actually remained there with his boot on stage. In fact, when he went to make the tip request, he put his foot on stage, and when he sat down, he stayed with it. You can see it somewhat here at the bottom, just barely on stage, but this was he kept that physical proximity well past what was expected here. And in making the tip request, he also, he paid money, but he inserted it into the F hole, the F-shaped sound hole of the tambura bass. Placing money in the hole of the instrument is typical for, say, the contra tambura, which has a large circle, and afterward the musician can extract it. It might not be the easiest thing to do, but it's possible. It's very, very difficult to do this from the narrow holes in the tambura bass and the berbe. For all I know, it's probably still in the instrument today. So, again, going through these gestures would have a typical signification, right? He was actually paying money, but in this case, the band wasn't really receiving money. So he was doing this in a way that blocks off the typical signification, and instead is more about an enforced type of intimacy with the group. And they were left with, trying to figure out how to react to this. Due to other circumstances, which they asked me not to elaborate in particular, they ended up leaving. So they did find, sort of agency of them in of themselves to step away from a bad situation, but it went much farther beyond this. I'm not going to comment much more on exactly why they left, but it's worth knowing that, I do see a certain form of agency in their reactions to this theme, but it's one that always has to deal with concerns of, wanting to get a better name, economic considerations, also the pride of their gender and representing, a kind of a empowered moment in women's music history. It was happening in the early 2010s. Gorabache and other female professionals have enjoyed far greater professional freedoms in the first decades of the 21st century, and significant ideological shifts toward expectations for women's inclusion professionally and in discourses of civil society have precipitated their active involvement in new social and professional roles. While Gorabache by no means proclaim themselves feminists, their adoption and fulfillment of the Bechar image as they bend gender roles in playing out late at night is decidedly a move of gendered empowerment. Yet many men and women still often find themselves subsumed under patriarchal hierarchies, especially at events where tamburaci typically perform. There, relatively progressive systems of thought regarding gender roles and relations still come up against more conservative structures of understanding masculine and feminine positionalities. These structures, however, are not purely conscious or ideological, but involve also the assemblages of bodies and the understandings and affects archived in participants' external gestures and distributed subjectivities. More than analogs to the affective block, intimate assemblages are indeed sites for the blocking of affect in aggregation, and simultaneously the blocking in delimitation of ideological tenets that might otherwise counter earlier existing systems of thought, whose resilience lies in being translated into embodied habitus. At the confluence of information sharing and extended group archiving of affects, these are prime sites for homosociality, which is linked to modern music listening practices the world over. Within this space, the sharing and circulating of affects serves even further to structure and delimit the ideas and sensibilities possible within the social. For the most part, musicians recognize the tacit rules and obligations that attend expectation and fantasies of intimate masculine and feminine subjectivity, especially those formulated and projected within the proximate close bodily formations in which their music resonates most immediately. Particularly when their incomes depend on successfully following these rules and meeting these obligations, they work hard to be unproblematic, and moreover, to foster successfully the intimate atmosphere and relations in which so many guests eagerly join in order to be on good terms with the musicians, to be good with them. This almost always requires negotiating gendered power relations, though in many cases without the need for deliberate alteration of behavior, repertoire, and so forth. Given most male bands' experience with and integration in the scene, yet in-group relations too are characterized by power relations, even in the engendering of solidarity, and sometimes especially so. The first two entries on the Gorabache thread on forum.tambura.com.hr, website for discussing such bands, praised the band for really knowing how to create an atmosphere with its excellent matching of repertoire, and even for surpassing an established women's tambura band. But this drew comments from the latter ensemble that there are so few tambura players who are women that it is smarter for us, quote, to support and help one another and not to quarrel, close quotation. Individuals of diverse gender or racial backgrounds often face more palpably volatile relations, however. When musicians or audience members perceivably violate expectations for their behavior based on groups with which they are identified, women, foreigners, Roma, etc., the assertion of power between audiences and bands that is almost unnoticeable at most events suddenly mobilizes to enforce a physical, violating yet ultimately restabilizing closeness. This closeness both corrects for and describes the problem caused by the musicians or audience members who are out of place. So these are forms of inclusion that are emotionally and painfully sometimes, emotionally and physically sometimes painful. And that make it difficult to join in the same manner and the same affective milieux of tambura listenership that male Croat bands can take advantage of. Ultimately, this makes it more difficult to counter certain discourses of exclusion, certain discourses about who should be included in these types of milieus. And this comes from this dual blocking. So the blocking of affect that aggregates certain forms of physical assemblages and embodied feeling together to regulate the structures of inclusion, but also the blocking off, the closing off, the resistance towards certain discourses, certain ideas and ideologies that could intervene in these structures against which the musicians who try to take these more progressive approaches to playing now find themselves actively battling. Well, thank you so much for your attention today. I'd be happy to entertain questions.
Thank you so much, Ian. Yeah, we have to just turn off the sound. Thank you so much, Ian, for this wonderful lecture. So the floor for questions is open, just to remind our listeners on Zoom that they can post questions in chat, while we can also, as there are some people here listening live the lecture, so we also post questions here. So maybe I can start first. So thank you so much. There's so many different and very rich examples of how affective block can work, in which settings, which listeners. So my more general question is, you can tell us more actually how far this affective block works. So which are extent, what is really intervention, what is normalizing. So also in a sense, how in some of your examples, you also present some individual experience of affective block, because you cannot simply feel or you don't want. It's, I think, very interesting fine distinction between how you actually rationalize what you don't want to, what you refuse, or what you cannot simply. So if you can tell us more, a little bit about these nuances, and if these affective block also different performance settings. We have kafana, we have stage performance, also in a sense of stage, more kind of representation, identity, stake on tambura, and then diaspora. So they're very, very diverse. How you can see the scale and the part of intervention, or how far is the part of any normal, any effective.
When it comes to using humor deliberately to block off or to limit certain types of experiences from other experiences, I mean, certainly there has to be a crossing the threshold. So it's not exactly normalized, although it's a regular occurrence that I saw. So in other words, the joke has to be funny. And if you hear a joke over and over again, you won't have exactly the same diffusion, let's say, of intensity or of feeling, which can be an experience of release, right? A joke builds tension, and then you get the punchline, you get the moment of understanding what the joke is, or the moment of reaction that lets something go. So for that to happen, you do have to have potential. And so I imagine for performers, it probably, the joke gets old at a certain point, although it can be reinforced. The idea of sincerity or subjective interaction is really important here, where, I worked with people performing more in the folklore setting, where you do the same routine on stage. Skoro probably rehearses to a certain extent, also, although I think for him, he certainly projects this idea of always, being fresh and having, interacting directly with the audience and drawing off of them. So to give another example, this comes from the diaspora, but I think it's also telling for that example of Miroslav Škoro's performance. I saw numerous ensembles in the Pittsburgh area perform Romany repertoire, and often would have a particular type of joke that's important there, about thievery, often stereotypes, but ones that would make it local in a very unexpected way. So pulling out Pittsburgh Steelers American football teams paraphernalia and seeing young children playing these roles on stage, playing Roma in a folklore ensemble, doing the Romani set in their multi-ethnic performance group, and so seeing how when they take on the Roma figures, they're suddenly stealing things, but what they're stealing turn out not to be Croatian or Serbian paraphernalia from the person they're robbing, but rather American sports paraphernalia. So that type of joke, which after doing it 15, 20 times in rehearsal is no longer as funny for the people who are doing it, but suddenly it gets reinvigorated when the parents see them for the first time. And those moments of really exaggerated humor tend to correspond to how different culturally and racially the subject of the performance is. So it's more intense laughter, which has, I read it as this diffusion effect, away from a sense of internalized or shared feeling. But you're asking most about the nuances then between different settings, so diversity of tambura music settings, and how
and also maybe about the listener. Like I would like to turn the story from the perspective of the listener and the fear and educated, not educated, kafana listeners' expectations in listening and histories of listening. People probably also expect something different in kafana when they go and just want to relax. And I'm not just talking now about the structure of listening of listeners in the sense of ethnic racial. I'm more thinking about the setting and the listener and the expectation behind, which is also, of course, associated with the histories of listening or affective association or affective regimes when you listen before. But what you got from the perspective of listeners maybe.
So in kafana, in the taverns, or in even some of the hotel restaurants set themselves up like a kafana, there's a striking difference between the interactions, the listening practices of the table who are being visited by the band, who pay for a particular song or give a tip and request song, versus those who are waiting their turns and perhaps lightly paying attention to the band, but it's more kind of in the atmosphere generally. You have certain things you see out of your peripheral vision, you have certain sounds you hear, you're probably vaguely aware of who the group is, and whether it's a Roma band versus a Croat band might guide certain expectations for when it's your turn. But really, I found that people requesting the same songs regardless of the ethnicity of the performance. So if you're listening, if you've requested the song, or if you're at your table to request the song and they're playing around you, then it's more like the type of intensive interaction that we saw with the concert settings, the party settings, where a band has been hired.
Actually, the difference between kafana wedding and, for example, stage performance, either at the state television or at a very prominent hall, where the intimacy is created through different means, and where the joke cannot always be said in the same way and also received in the same way. Or that was basically
with larger audiences, I find it's much more common for people to clap along, and so to have that sort of coordinated interaction. But primarily, I've witnessed that again with types of ensembles that really prioritize that type of very, what they would call very clean rhythmic coordination. And this also takes the form of applause for encores, where people accelerate the applause, and then suddenly a new, if the band doesn't come out immediately, a new slower beat will emerge from someone else, and everyone will coordinate to that. So there's ways in which even large audiences have forms of localized sociality. So for instance, a couple of people might start a particular beat of clapping, and others will join them. That I haven't heard or seen as much in the smaller settings, clapping along with a particular beat. People applaud after the performance. At concerts, not so much in the kafana setting, because people are often trying to get the next song request in. So in terms of how that then relates to the idea of affective block, I mean, certainly musicians then learn to control, learn to have certain forms of control over how they navigate those different spaces. And in some ways, they have, when they're on, when there are only a few listeners, say at a table, they have often a numbers game where they have more ability directly to interact on a one-on-one level and to try to guide a certain form of dictation, which sometimes actually takes the form of physically rearranging their listeners. So for instance, suggesting a colo. So people are getting too rowdy, it's really drawing attention only to a few drunken men who are really trying to control everything and who are, physically closing off the rest. And so they might say, hi, de colo, and they'll suggest those men go to a different part of the kafana and start, this is particularly places that have outside seating and might have people sitting right there at tables, but also a little bit of space. I've seen bands very effectively do that, which allows them to, shift the atmosphere in different ways, right? To allow people to continue, but affects are not intensities, or we want to call place them in terms of qualified emotions or named emotions, joy versus sadness. You can have a diversity of people reacting in different ways, right? It's not a monolithic audience. The applauding in a large setting might suggest that, but there are, of course, different ways people react. So bands can sometimes find ways to allow that diversity to play out.
Thank you so much. Some other questions? Can I relate to Anna? Thank you, Ian, very much. I was just thinking, did you observe this affective responses only through your participation, and you didn't do interviews with listeners?
I interviewed, yes, yes.
Okay. I'm sorry, it was very tense, so maybe I didn't.
Yes, no, I didn't read many interviews, but I have them in here. So people, for instance, talk about the experience of goosebumps. I wasn't trying to record, look at people's skins. This all comes from the interviews. Yeah, so people talk very much about that as the height, the best moment you can have is having that. And for some experience, people can tell me, but they could tell me exactly why. It's recognizing that this is, 100 still tamburaša, 100 tambura players from the entire, well, I'd say the entire country. It's mostly from central Croatia, or it's not from Dalmatia as much, but the historical region of Croatia and Slavonia and this part. Sometimes also Croats from Hungary or from Serbia or Bosnia or from the diaspora of the United States might come and play in these ensembles as well. And so people talked about what that meant to them and link there the emotional or affective response to a very strong idea of what is happening there and what it means. Whereas musicians I interviewed talking about Roma performance, they couldn't give me an idea of exactly why they were acting that way. It wasn't the size of the ensemble. The best they could do, they felt, was to tell me that it sounds dirty. And I noted that they distinguished very carefully in rehearsal spaces the idea of cleaning up a performance to make it better, cleaning up a rendition or a particular version of a piece of music, orchestral, jazz, folk music, whatever it might be, in order to make it sure. And people also contrasted this, for instance, with, so I heard directors complain that it sounds too Hungarian if people are playing the offbeats too early. It sounds like Hungarians are playing. And so they try to get it, in orchestral settings, really precisely at the midpoint between one strong beat and the next. Professional tambura bands, there's a little more flexibility where the contras, the person playing the contra Bulgarian chord player, can push it a little bit, but just the one instrument really has that role. And musicians talked about that difference as well in interviews.
Sorry, you're talking about now listeners, like educated listeners or ordinary listeners, how they experience these interviews. sorry, just to repeat.
Yes,
Or I mean, musicians as the listeners, or also ordinary listeners coming to these, how they would say it's understood dirty if they do that, like ordinary people or not.
I mean, the term dirtiness in regard to performance technique, I heard mostly coming from musicians who might not all have a particular type of musical education, but have musical experience. Dirtiness, I heard, so you hear the stereotypical descriptions of Roma as dirty people, unfortunately, among a broader range of listeners. I didn't hear them as much use that term to describe their listening. People talk about, imaju strašan sluh. They have a great sense of listening, and would tie that to their rhythm. The dirtiness discourse I heard mostly from professional or amateur tamburashi. And we have a question in the room and also one on here. So Anna, I think you're, however you, I don't know the order.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I wanted to just maybe build up on this dirty, clean dichotomy, and also basically something which is rather important frame for your whole study, and that's playing dangerously. When you spoke with these people and when you did your field work, to which extent this danger playing was really an elaborated concept through which they position themselves as opposed to someone playing not dangerously, and what it means and how it relates to is the dichotomy you are developing between clean and dirty playing. I'm asking all of this because now the linguist is speaking out of me. In Serbo-Croatian, saying on opasno svira basically means he's playing damn good and not dangerously. Mala opasno peva would be, that's really, yeah. So there is this semantic transfer, and I'm wondering what's here at stake. Yeah.
What's here at stake? Yeah, good question. I mean, this is something that's, it's not something that I hear in the moment. It's a general acclamation, usually for a tambura player, that in general, this is someone who plays. And so, for instance, even since he was a child, he's been playing dangerously. So it refers, you don't hear usually, on sad opasno svira. He's right now, I listen and watch him, and I can tell he's playing dangerously, but it's a general acclamation. But it's something that is reserved really for musicians who start to push successfully into more the Romani style of playing. So I've heard it said about Romani tambura players. I've heard it said about some of the Croatian American tambura players who have been active since the 90s in the Požega Festival, for instance, so Jerry Grčević, Peter Kosovek, and musicians like that. Zlatni Dukati, described as playing dangerously, who rename themselves Najbolji Hrvatski tamburaši, and who are still considered one of the best bands ever to have played, especially from their work in the 1990s. So this is a very special acclamation that refers to virtuosity. I take the point about playing damned good, that it might not have the same connotation of danger always in that way. But at the same time, there is a sense in which you have to transgress something musically. So you actually have to transgress this clean style of playing a little bit, and be able to ride that or play with that less defined beat in a way that still succeeds, in a way which I saw some tambura players not succeed here. So that's where I see this as having that transgressive quality on a social, musical level that does take some risk, right? Because there are bands who try it and don't play damn good and don't succeed, and there are real consequences musically, perhaps even socially or economically if they don't get hired again for that.
Okay, now we have another question from Zoom before giving word to Katja. So, Mojca Piško, can you unmute yourself? Yes.
Thank you very much, Ian, for this inspiring lecture.
Mojca, we don't hear you. Maybe it's just our...
Sorry, now? It's better?
Now it's okay.
Yeah, okay. It's my headphones. Thank you for the lecture. It was really like layered and inspiring. I thought I wanted to ask you, could you maybe comment on the opposite side of things happening in Croatia nowadays? And this is the professionalization of television orchestra, tambura orchestra, but also on the fact that that tambura is not official part of the studies offered at the Academy of Music in Zagreb. Can you maybe comment on the exclusionary practices that might multiply through this process, in a sense of micropolitics of disciplining the performance, the repertoire, and also the affective load in the settings that are more similar to symphonic orchestra performances and things like that, and where this strategy of giving dignity to the instrument, which is like one of the narratives that we have, somehow will also contribute even more to eliminating this dirtiness of playing and effectively working with the instrument and the tradition.
Great question. I only heard a bit about, I think the sound wasn't great for the part we were asking about the radio orchestra, for instance. Comments. This, I'd say, at least in my field work, which went up more or less until 2015, a little bit in 2017 as well, a sense of mutual elitism or exclusion between Zagreb performance and education systems and institutions and those in Slavonia. So, for instance, many people, musicians I spoke with in Slavonia talk about, Zagreb, they often use different system of tamburas, Jankovic, I forget now, but tuned in fifths rather than fourths. So it's not an easy transition to make from one instrument to the other. They have a slightly different sound, which people, at least musicians, talk about being able to hear very clearly, and feel that at least that time in early 2000s up to early 2010s to about 2015, that musicians in Zagreb were mostly coming through those circles, and still tamburaša, which plays in Zagreb, is different, where they really prioritize Slavonian musicians, but the ensemble in Zagreb they felt was somewhat exclusionary, and they in turn, at least in terms of admitting people to the hierarchy of those who play most dangerously or those who are the best tambura players, would speak poorly about many tambura musicians, except for those who came from Slavonia and established themselves in Zagreb. Sto tamburaša then becomes this meeting point where you do have musicians primarily from Slavonia, but also from elsewhere, primarily men, but also increasingly, I think there were maybe upwards of 8 women out of the 100 by the last concerts that I was watching. So very slow, perhaps gradual growth, but very slow growth there, performing in Slavonia, in central Croatia, and often in places like Peć or Budapest. And these forms of exclusion were not always, they weren't strict in that regard, but they were very palpable, at least in the level of sociality and discourse. And musicians I met on those performance tours for Sto tamburaša, many of them actually had complained about the level of the push toward professionalization and education going too far, sometimes in Croatia itself, but sometimes of their own accord. So I met musicians who had gone to study balalaika technique or study masters of mandolin and balalaika performance in Italy and in Russia, musicians who had gone to American conservatories and done tambura and felt that they actually had lost something at times. They had lost that ability to kind of push more creatively beyond the idealized perfect performance that you say in terms of rhythm that would have very clean and technical execution that would transition perhaps gradually in dynamics that wouldn't push. And they recognize that some listeners really, and listeners I spoke to say, we prefer the amateurs. We prefer people who, don't always want to listen to people who got used to playing to accompany famous singers in radio orchestras or for CDs and recordings, but who, have that closer village feeling and who have that experience. Also in that regard, there's a gendered aspect to the resistance toward professionalization, where they feel that often it's women, so men tambura players I spoke to complain that they felt often women who really pursued that very technical form of execution and performance and received a higher level of education when they might be playing tambura actually at the university level or as part of their university level music studies, were those who were best positioned to get teaching positions, whereas those who were great virtuosos but hadn't received formal schooling didn't always have access to those careers. And so there's this tension over class and gender coming together, where women who are often excluded from performance venues and from who might face these very tense forms of inclusion when they do pursue professional band careers might be actually better positioned to get stabler forms of income, maybe not the best paying jobs, but stable forms of income at folklore societies, at schools for tambura. If I haven't answered some part of your question, I'd love to, please let me know.
Yeah, I was also referring to the fact that now we have like university study just for tambura, and here we have the limitation of, expanding in a way of repertoire, but also limitation of repertoire, which also brings all of these things that you have in other settings, like this clean space of performance, which is performers are on the stage. You have the audience, which is like divided from them, and many of these aspects are lost. And on the other hand, you have this tendency to like introduce serious repertoire for tambura. So somehow I feel that something that was in the same space is becoming even more divided. And I think that actually this thing of dirtiness of playing is being cleaned out from this professional settings of performing. So yeah.
Yeah, I remember, for instance, when Ivo Josipovic was president. So he actually is a trained composer, and one of his compositions, something like Drmeš za Penderecko, so a Drmeš, circle dance in the style or in honor of Penderecki, a famous Polish composer, which a lot of Penderecki's music actually has that clashing of instruments. So perhaps not a rhythmic discrepancy, but a tonal or harmonic discrepancy, and that's very much there in his composition. That I remember a performance of that. I don't think it was To Tamburaše. I think it was the radio orchestra in Zagreb that prepared that particular piece in his honor, and involved in we come to To Tamburaše concerts or to some of the diaspora concerts. Lots of the Croatian fraternity in North America, for instance, is a very powerful organization, donating millions of dollars to Croatia. So presidents often get involved. So on that level, in the political sphere, tambura, but not the professional bands. It was more folklore tambura and orchestral tambura. So exactly the traditions that have often been pushed to the forefront of institutional tambura performance were once again, very popular. So when Croatia joined the EU, for instance, also it was tambura samnica. So what many people perhaps. Some people argue incorrectly, some scholars argue incorrectly, but many people still perceive as the original tambura, a solo tambura instrument, was the one that was featured in the central square in Zagreb on that concert, among many other performers, but not the professional tambura bands. And there's this idea of, tamburashi, the professional bands, they play in Slavonia, where everyone's a pig farmer, and so these cultural, class-based discourses of inferiority are certainly very present there. Yes.
Okay, so we have 2 questions.
I have a question regarding the racialized diasporic aesthetics, and you have, if you have also worked conceptual tool as a sub-phenomenon of othering, exoticization, and especially if in the interviews with musicians that are racialized, if you met the strategy of over-identification as affective blocking, like over-identification with exotization, which is projected on them. If you have like some.
I could share a couple more from the diaspora with regard to racialization in particular. With regard to exoticization, I mean, lots of the performing ensembles, especially vocal ensembles for teenagers and young adults, but also there's some adult vocal groups. Often do everything from including Macedonia, and there's often a travelogue narrative of the Croatian ensemble nominated anyone who wants basically can join as long as they are a certain age and students have a certain skill expectation. But often, so one instance, have a travelogue story where Croatian goes to Serbia and learns Serbian styles. He goes to Bosnia and learns Bosnian styles. And eventually gets to Macedonia. So there's this reproduction of forms of internal exoticization within South Slavic communities, where Macedonia might be perceived as musically and also culturally and religiously, perhaps ethnically, racially, the most common. And that particular instance, the Croats ends up marrying or wedding a Macedonian girl who sounds so there is racialization that also reclaims that broader space. That has to do with also the way in which I also heard Slovaks involved in these ensembles. So we're all just hunkies. We don't like a lot of people use that term, but internally. Sort of like how the N-word is used and claimed internally among African Americans. It doesn't have exactly the same history because many of these people, since the mid-20th century or late 20th century, have moved to suburbs and are no longer subject to the forms of external exoticization or othering they encountered. In terms of strategic centralization, or no, it wasn't strategic centralization, but the other
over-identification.
It's an interesting idea. I think about that. I'd say when it comes to interaction with white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, other might not be othered in the same way anymore in the United States and Canada. I'd say there's more an attempt really to find common ground. So I've heard tambura bands and bluegrass bands touring together, for instance, and trombone groups trying to play up that rather as a strategy of trying to assimilate, and also these were styles of music you could hear on vaudeville tours and taco circuits, traveling companies of theater actors and musicians back in the early 20th century. Before the idea of American music was stabilized in the way that it is. It's never quite stable, but it's changed over the years. So there's been attempts to do that, I think, rather than over-identification. I'll think about it. I'd be interested to explore that idea more.
Yeah. Thank you, Ian, so much. I would like to point out maybe two things from the presentation, and I will go a little bit back also to Anna's question. First, when I was listening to you, I was trying to make some parallels actually with my research in Kosovo, with Romanis and other ethnic groups and so. And I found when we search about this affective power of music, I interviewed some musicians, and I learned about the existence of the psychological strategies, some kind of analysis on the spot, let's say in the taverns when they play And then how they recognize, according to the feeling of the person, actually what to play, how to accommodate, whether it will be a fast tune, or should it be something very melancholic and so on, just to meet the expectation in the sense, and then of course get the tip and so as a consequence. So I'm curious whether you find something like this. And the other thing, particularly for the genre called Talava over there, it was very difficult for the Romani musicians to, for example, ask the organizers of the feast, if it is like a feast in somebody's home, about the family members, you know, what are the family situations, so that they can include them in the improvised kind of songs, improvised lyrics. I'm also curious whether you found maybe something of this kind in your research. And then I very much like in your presentation about also the gender specifics and ethnic specifics in this case, like taking into consideration, let's say, Roman bands and Croatian and Serbian bands and so on. Also about, for example, the phenomenon of female ensembles. I'm particularly curious about the klapas. I think this is comparable in a sense, because since the appearance of klapas in Croatia, of course, there are different opinions about how appropriate. So some people really still have problems with this. But of course, we had a similar phenomenon here in Narodna Zabavna glazba in Slovenia, or even in Bali, for example, and so this is some kind of trend that we find in different situations. In Kosovo, in particular, I remember one situation about the Shom ensembles, which were typically Romani for such a long time. Then at some point, the ethnic Shom drums appeared, and it was like a total sensation, and everybody was so curious about this. And I think this is, again, maybe something that compared to the appearance of female ensembles, even though in this case also it shows to modernity, you know, to the impact of feminism and also other trends and ideologies. And I think I should stop at this point. I have more things to say. There is a very nice study I would just have by Enisa Hadrovic. This is my classmate from the undergraduate studies, and she did something very much comparable to Van de Poort, who did it much later actually, about the Romani ensemble just playing in the Zagreb area, you know, and then people would come there just with the same expectations as Van de Poort, very nice in his book. Sorry, maybe these are too many things now, but if you can just refer to any of this, it would be fine.
Thank you. Yeah, really rich questions. So, question first, you had two questions about how Roma performers in particular cultivate interactions in kafana setting. So from the level of reading people's emotions and perhaps commenting on or incorporating family aspects into songs, repertoire. And then the second was about the moment of more kind of gendered development of groups and how this corresponds to the desire to patronize, you know, groups that are special in some way or different in some way, whether gender or ethnicity. Okay, great. I've also watched, you know, interacted with Romani bands in, say, Novi Sad or Belgrade, and I think the interactions are different from what I experienced in Osijek in a number of ways. So first of all, they're, you know, this is not different, but in requesting largely popular Croatian ballads, tambura ballads from the 1990s and early 2000s. So requesting these songs that don't really have a moment for interjecting anything personal. That form of interaction comes more in the Bacharac tradition, which I've never heard a Romani band actually play in kafana, but it's not as much something I've heard in, you know, a kafana or krčma type of setting, restaurant. That's more something that you'd hear at weddings that I've heard, or at larger gatherings where the band might start with the Bacharac. So the Bacharac is a, you know, decasyllabic, 10-syllable tradition, semi-improvised, where you can interject the name, for instance, of a host, and there. I have the sense that musicians do the research ahead of time if they need to, you know. they don't really need too much though. It's usually a matter of recognizing the host. So saying, hey, Antun, you're an old rake, an old cruiser, you know, the stereotypical types of phrases that are used, and you can easily change the name, or just making sure they know enough of the right ones to sing to the kun, the best man, or the witness at certain parts of wedding celebration. In Kafana, I haven't heard Bacharats sung much, and it's mostly been by Croat bands who are playing for what they probably perceive as a mostly Croatian, or at least not a Roma clientele. Roma certainly do pick up on the, you know, I think all performers in this close settings of playing in a restaurant or a bar try to pick up on the reactions of the audience members. But those interactions and the reactions of performers, or sorry, audience members, are often much more focused on lyrics than I've encountered in, say, parts of Serbia. So the interaction of having your hands held high, that's something that you don't see quite as much in Croatia at tables. You see it more, well, I should say Croatia, I should say, in my particular experiences in Osijek and Slavonski Brod and some of the cities around them, where people do that more when they step out around the band. But that doesn't happen in restaurants as much. That's usually for a party, an occasion where the band has been hired specifically for the occasion in a different way than happens at restaurants. So the type of cultivation of interaction seems to happen, at least from my experience, more through knowing what songs to play, you know, being able to play several Miroslav Škoro songs in a row if someone requests one of his hits. And so we might do, you know, a couple of ones I played here for us, but then extend through some other popular hits of the early 90s. In regards to more intersections of gender and ethnicity, so the female performers that I was working with, the professional bands, largely were not writing their own songs, at least not yet. And so the repertoire they performed was a combination of their own hits, their own recordings that were often written by other male performers, and then popular hits. So it's interesting aspect there where they're often, you know, singing, and because Croatian, like most other languages, is a very gendered language, you know, they're often singing from a male standpoint because so much of the repertoire is written from a male standpoint. So it was interesting then to see ways in which when they actually do have material that is their own, that is written from a female standpoint, like the song I shared, it often draws upon these older Yugoslav era performance traditions of both Roma and non-Roma just or Tsigan performers, right? People who like Vucho and Esma Rajapova. So this repertoire that was very popular across broad parts of Yugoslavia, that often drew upon, you know, Russian romance repertoire, and that often is incorporated into those perspectives. You know, so the very fact that they call themselves Garavushe, they did in fact all, you know, have dark hair, but there's a lot of repertoire that refers to the term Garava or Garavusha, in particular with regard to Roma performers, not just Tsiganka Samala, but I had to look back to my notes, but there are other examples as well. I don't know if that's answering that particular question, but that's what comes to mind immediately.
Okay. So maybe I will just have a closing question because this is also important for our project. You mentioned lyrics, and I was thinking, because very often when we discuss affect, we also tend to think about you know, affective economies and affective regimes as something which escaping some, you know, meanings, or something that can go beyond representational. So these are some of the dominant understandings sometimes in music and sound studies. So on the other hand, there are many other works discussing how this is necessary interrelated, and you also said that. So I'm thinking maybe you can just refer at the end for us how the lyrics, for example, and also the type of songs, which are, or the song, for example, which is thematizing Slavonia or Croatia, can also produce affective block, and how affective block works in relation to song lyrics, in relation to meanings and ideologies behind content. So the very end of the song.
Now, the content of the song, there's interesting discourse around crying and emotionality with regard to the performers and whether one should become emotional, because many tambura songs do have a very intensive emotional aspect, especially love songs or songs about lost loves. So Miroslav Škoro, for instance, had a performance in I think it was just before I was doing my fieldwork. I think it was around maybe 2006, 2007, where he famously cried, and because he had a song about his mother that he wrote while she was alive, and then after she died, and he plays up a lot in his autobiography as well, that it was his audience who took over singing for him because he couldn't continue. And so those treatments of sincerity at that level, a superstar breaking down crying, are read very positively. But from the standpoint of a working band who's really depending not on that removal of the stage and not on that superstar status, but really being able to deliver, you as a musician need to be in control of your emotions. And it might also involve being in control of your emotional reaction or potential emotional reaction to the man who's come up and is hanging off you drunkenly and singing along with you and not getting up his turn, not getting a chance to take other tips. So the form of emotional comportment needs to be very restrained at times, and yet there's this double expectation, right? Also of being a very sincere performer, and that can be very important as well. So I think that musicians, I didn't really ask this question as much about the lyrics. How do you avoid, if you've written the song, if it's your own band's song, and it's about your personal experience, how do you avoid being too emotional, or do you need to be emotional? But bands know hundreds of songs, so at a certain point for them, it's just becomes one more song. It's just the lyrics. And musicians, I think, around the world talk about this experience of you've sung the song so many times and you have such a large repertoire that you don't hear it the same way that the audience does, and that actually becomes a way of allowing you to continue. But there is this, certainly for superstars like Škoro, prioritization on his part, and also, seemingly from his audience as well, of that emotional experience coming through. And that is a reaction to lyrics and certain words that choke you up, that make you cry, or that make you feel something that isn't what you're nominally being paid for. But the band is always expected to keep playing, right? It's the singer. So Škoro doesn't actually play an instrument usually when he performs with tambura musicians. When he plays with a rock band, he plays guitar sometimes, but he's not a tambura player. He became famous as a tambura composer and singer.
Okay, thank you, Ian, so much. Thank you all present here and people also present on Zoom. I think we are already more than 1 hour and a half over. So thank you again. I'll invite others to join for some other lecture within affectalk lecture series. And thank you again, Ian, for being with us.